I want to talk with you a bit about paraprofessionals and their roles that they play in working and supporting children with severe profound disabilities. As you probably know, or maybe even have been a participant in a classroom such as the ones that we're talking about this semester, the role of the paraprofessional is very important. There tend to be more paraprofessionals in classrooms with students with severe profound disabilities, as well as more one-on-one paraprofessionals who work within a setting and are identified as being the lead support for one student only. Although they would work, I'm sure in other areas of the classroom, that's their primary goal, and the target of their work is that student. I think because of the kind of work that goes on in the classrooms that we're discussing this semester, it's extremely important that we make certain that we build teams with paraprofessional staff that are effective and in which comfortable relationships can form and effective working alliances can develop. It's incredibly important that this happen. I know because I've worked in many, many settings, both as a teacher, as a consultant, etc., where the primary problem oftentimes in the classroom in terms of tensions and conflicts and anxieties, etc., are coming as a result of issues with paraprofessional staff. Now, if you are a paraprofessional and you're listening, I have lots of respect for paraprofessional staff. And I do not mean to diminish their work or to group people, as in all paraprofessionals do, all paraprofessionals are like. That's not my intent at all, because I've worked with many fantastic paraprofessional staff. However, one thing that divides paraprofessional staff oftentimes from the professional staff, meaning the licensed staff, is about training. It is really about whether they have gone beyond high school, have they gone to college, have they had training in the area of education or in social sciences of some sort. And you often find quite a range. I mean, I've worked with people who have been former teachers who have come back to work as a paraprofessional because it worked better for them in their life at that point. And I've worked with other people who have graduated high school, and that's the extent of their educational preparation. That's not to suggest somebody who only has a high school degree would not be a good paraprofessional. However, the divide, maybe that's not a good word for it, but the separation sometimes between those who have gone through a more professional journey in preparing them for the role and those who have not tend to come out in the work in terms of how able people are to take on responsibilities, to understand important concepts, to participate professionally in the school setting. Those things all seem to come a little easier to people who have had more training. At least that's been in my experience. But either way, it's really important that we train all of the staff who work with us to be able to effectively work within our classrooms and to effectively support our students in a manner that is consistent with the IEP and also within a manner that is philosophically sound. Okay? So let me start with the fact that just giving people their roles and responsibilities, detailing those, is very important. I have worked with many paraprofessionals who've said to me, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do. He or she just kind of tells me all of a sudden do this or do that. Sadly, one paraprofessional told me not too long ago, I usually know what to do when I've been gotten in trouble for doing something wrong. Like she learns from being in trouble what she was supposed to have done. And that's a really sad scenario. I mean, it might have been her perspective. I don't know. But it's a sad scenario. And one that I wouldn't want any of you to be in, where you end up setting up a negative situation and possibly a negative relationship because you have not been clear about the roles and responsibilities. Another piece is communication. You need to talk to paraprofessionals about how to communicate with you. What information goes to you? What things do they ask you before they act on? For example, in a classroom where I was recently, a paraprofessional handed off, for lack of a better term, a kid to someone else because they said they really needed him at this point for whatever. Well, the kid was supposed to be somewhere else. I don't know. The point is, she really should have just checked in with the teacher to make sure it was okay. It wasn't a case of the paraprofessional trying to usurp the teacher, but by not checking in, they didn't know where the kid was, people trying to find out what it, you get the whole picture. And so it turns out to be something that just gets difficult when you don't check in with the teacher. Okay? Now, what I have found is that teachers are not always consistent about that. And I've heard that from paraprofessionals many times. Like, well, sometimes she says, don't take him anywhere until you've asked me. And then other times, if I don't take him, she'll say, why are you standing there? It's like, well, I was waiting for you to ask you. It's like, well, it's time for. So, you don't want to give mixed signals. You want to tell people how to communicate. And particularly, you want to be able to do that in a way that the paraprofessional feels heard, and that the paraprofessional does not feel like that they will be judged, or that you will take any kind of attitude about it and utilize that against them in some way. That's a big fear of paraprofessional staff in addressing professional staff, and I know that because I've heard this many, many times. I actually think it's best if you even did, like during the week at some point, like Friday or something, 5 minutes with each paraprofessional in your class. 5 minutes. What's going on, anything I need to know, any questions that you have, etc. Now, I encouraged a teacher to start meeting with paraprofessional staff that way, and what she told me was most helpful is she would start hearing things from each of them, like the same thing, like, I don't really get this, or this doesn't make sense, or I don't know why we're doing that, or something. Anyway, what she was saying is that when she would hear like 2 or 3 or 4 people talking about something, or bringing that up, it helps her understand where she wasn't either clearly communicating things, or where things that she thought she had made known to them in some way hadn't gotten through. And she took this as an opportunity to really start understanding what it was that she wanted to use in keeping communication open with paraprofessional staff, but also for something else that I recommended was a memorandum of understanding. I said, why don't you just have like this memorandum of understanding? You don't even have to call it a contract. You can just call it a memorandum of understanding. We have talked about these things. These are your roles. These are your responsibilities. This is the way you communicate with me. This is the way if you have a problem with me, this is who you would go talk to next, or whatever. The kinds of things that all of us, really, at least me, I work better when I have those kinds of limitations set on me. Okay, and I'm calling them limitations on purpose because a lot of times we do feel limited. It's like, well, how come I can't do this, and how come I can't do that? And stuff. But when I know that these are, maybe a better word is parameters, this is what, where I'm supposed to work and what I'm supposed to do, it makes me feel much safer and much more secure in being able to enact my job. And I know that many other people will say the same thing. It's like, well, if I know what I'm supposed to do, or if I know what gets me in trouble or what doesn't, that's the worst. I know I kind of mentioned that already, but it's when people go like, I don't even know what gets him mad, or something, like he just kind of all of a sudden I'm in trouble. It's a very bad situation to be in. Two things that I would bring up that are just really vital to working with paraprofessionals is ensuring that they have a complete understanding of confidentiality. Confidentiality, to people like you and me who've dealt with it for a long time and know what it means and all that sort of stuff, is really, we don't really look at it as being such a terribly difficult concept. But in reality, it is a little tough sometimes. I just had a situation the other day, and this is something working with a private client, but the person said to me, you know, asked me a question about whether someone had called me, and all of a sudden I was like, is that confidential information? I sit in my head for a second and said, I'm not sure I can answer that. Like, literally, all of a sudden I'm like, wait, if this person did this, every now and then you're in a situation where it feels so easy to answer something, and like you get a moment, as I did that night, and go, wait a minute, I have to think this through for a second. I have to figure this out. Um, it's just not always as easy as it looks, even though we think that it is. But many people don't fully get it, and it needs to be discussed. One of the things that I always share with people that I think is extremely important is confidentiality means information is shared on a need to know basis. And I would really get that across to them. It is shared on a need to know basis. I'm not going to come and talk to you about something that I read in a file just because I can. So, in other words, if we work in the same school and there's something crazy going on with one of the families I'm working with, and you live up the street from the mom or some such thing, right? Just because we have confidentiality, I mean, between us, we can talk because we're within the realm of which we can speak. That's not information you need to know about. And so confidentiality is more than just the law. It's like, why are you sharing it? Like, why are you sharing it? Is it relevant? Is it necessary? Is it legal? You need to answer those questions because that oftentimes is where you'll get people to understand better what it means about confidentiality. An incident that happened last year with a paraprofessional that I was working with is she was taking photos of the kids at school that were cute and stuff, and then putting them on Instagram to her friends. And she thought it was so cute. She liked the kids, blah, 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 blah. I about freaked out. I'm like, get those pictures down, the whole 9 yards. And I don't have to explain to you why that was a violation of confidentiality. But this was a young woman who was really excited about her job and was sharing it with her friends. Okay, it was that innocent. There was no desire to break confidentiality. But for many people, such as this young woman, her idea of breaking confidentiality was like telling secrets, I mean, like sharing something from the file with someone, that kind of thing, or telling information to someone. And because, as she said, I didn't put their names on there, right, then it wasn't like I was breaking confidentiality. I know if you've been working in confidentiality for a while, or environments where you use confidentiality, that kind of situation probably sounds really insane. But it was really instructive for me to see the level of innocence about what had happened, also knowing how bad it could be if somebody found out, their kids' pictures flying around somewhere. So, I mean, we worked it out. Everything was okay. But I just, reminded me that oftentimes when we think of violations of confidentiality, we oftentimes think of purposeful actions, things that people do to get around the law, to gossip, to, whatever. And this was an example of where none of those were true, but certainly we were in a big situation. So make sure that it's need to know, okay? Make sure it's legal, make sure it's relevant, okay? Because lots of times when people want information for all kinds of reasons, you don't know why they want it, and you want to give them just what you have to give them. I'll speak to that one more time as working as a therapist, as I give very little information when I have to go to court. And I take very brief notes. And so when I've had people ask me about that in court, like attorneys and stuff, I always say I protect the client's privacy. And I've gotten a little blowback about that. But what I learned, and it's not worth going into detail here, but it was I worked with a therapist who got in trouble because he released all this information um, that legally he could release, but it kind of really muddied up the case, and it caused him problems, and he got into much bigger issues, and they were kind of picking through everything to make a case out of all this information he gave him. And so I'm like, what's relevant to the case? What needs to be released? Why does it need to be released, right? That's just the big question, but always ask yourself, need to know. Do I need to tell this? Need to know. Another one is I would really encourage you to talk with your paraprofessionals about communicating with families. And I would really uh, suggest that you restrict what they talk about to niceties. And I mean, I don't mean that, like fake, but, pleasantries. How things are going at school with the kid or something, what's happening. But don't get into anything else for which it would involve another classmate, another family member. It might cause the teacher to need to address something or answer something. Oftentimes, again, getting back to confidentiality, many paraprofessional staff do not understand what could be said to parents that may backfire on them. And this has happened many times with people that I know where the paraprofessional has said something. Um, just one simple one that I can tell you was about a paraprofessional who the kid at school had gotten bitten, and the paraprofessional came in. I'm sorry, the parent came in, and the paraprofessional started talking to the parent about the family, and she was trying to be helpful, but she started talking about the other family and what they've been doing, and like he seems to be getting worse, stuff like that. It was her really helpful attempt to support the mom who was upset about the kid, having been bitten. That's what she was upset about. So that part of it, she got really, obviously was already wired up when she came there. And then the paraprofessional is sharing all this information. It's kind of like what I said earlier about, when I'm selective when I share with courts and stuff. It's like there's all this information that goes out there, and there's lots of things that you can play with after that. So, like, if the other parent's upset, she might have lots of weapons, like information and things to use against this family or with this boy based upon what the paraprofessional innocently was telling the parent. And that is one of the issues. And I'll just mention that quickly, I guess, that when parents are in crisis or they're feeling conflict or there's, something that's causing us to feel that we have not been uh, well, let me put it this way. When there's this tension that people bring in and the crisis and the anxiety raises, right? Like that, it tends for all of us. We want to start going like that, right? So I want to start going, oh, well, the reason this is blah, 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 blah. And the next thing you know, you've dumped a lot of confidential information. And it's only because you got excited with the anxiety. That's the other reason that I'm always really clear or suggest that people should be clear with paraprofessionals about the subjects that they should talk about and things like that. So anytime that a parent has a question about the curriculum or the parent has a question about the discipline or the behavioral program or anything like that, I always suggest that the paraprofessional direct the parent to the teacher. Because anytime you start answering questions from a parent, you, in a sense, are the official spokesperson, even if you aren't. The parent won't make that distinction. So that's enough about that. But confidentiality, making sure, especially with parents, that is upheld is incredibly important, and it's something that really, in my experience, I found must be taught, and it must be reviewed, and from time to time, tweak it a little bit. You hear somebody talking in the hallway, and may not be that big of a deal, but they're saying something and using a student's name or something, and it's like it's right on the line. It may not be like they've broken confidentiality technically, but those kinds of reminders keep all of us on guard about our responsibilities as being confidential and working with the students that we work with. The other piece that I think, well, I'm going to tie a few things together, but I guess I'd like to say that, especially in terms of behavior management, you must have a clear understanding of what it is that you do to direct behavior and to motivate whatever, address behavioral conflict or any other things that occur in that realm. You need to know those things well enough that you can teach them to people who are working with you, including the paraprofessional staff. It's probably one of the biggest areas in which everybody gets in a kerfuffle, and that would be around this area of behavioral management. Because, well, there's lots of reasons for it, but when kids are difficult to manage for whatever reason, I would say, in my experience, the less experienced you are, the less educated you are, the more apt someone is to use power and control as a mechanism for behavioral management. And I'm not a fan of power and control. In my estimation, power and control in behavior management is the last thing you want to do, exert power and control. You really want to build a collaborative alliance with the student, and you want the student to start working with you. Okay? So you might be using a number of strategies, like to build the student's abilities, competencies, and it might be something like, for example, waiting it out. Let's just say that you decided that we're going to wait for a minute to see if he'll stop crying or something like that. And the person who's working with this student gets, exasperated after 15 seconds. By 30 seconds, they're like, this teacher doesn't know what anything they're doing. And by a minute, it's like, look, grab the kid and go kind of thing, right? I'm just kind of making that up. But you get the point of how a strategy that might actually be evidence-based, it might be something that's within the IEP, whatever. It may not appear to be an effective strategy to someone who tends to move to power and control really quickly. So if your staff doesn't know, that are working with you, doesn't know what your behavioral management principles are and how you choose to uphold those principles in the classroom, this is going to be putting out fires all year long. All year long. Now, one of the things that I think is important is the sense that in your training of paraprofessionals, in your modeling as a teacher, etc., you want to be working with everybody to be building a greater rapport with the students and a greater rapport with the people they're working with. I mean, truly building a classroom community. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to really get a place of good rapport, get to a place of good rapport with people in the classroom, including the students, that tends to help with problems in the behavioral management area. Because instead of looking at it as a problem, a behavioral issue being a problem that I have to fix, it becomes rather working with the student to get past whatever this behavior is, this thrashing about, the yelling. I don't know what the student might be doing, but when you're working on building a rapport, it's very important that part of that be translated into behavior management, that we don't just shift all of a sudden, okay? So it's not like all of a sudden I'm like, hey, I'm really nice, and now I'm going to break bad on you. It's like I'm going to be this rapport guy no matter what's going on. I would teach that because my view of behavior management for kids that, especially kids who really need a lot of intensive support, is that they are so acted upon by so many adults all the time that if we don't make a good rapport, if we don't make it a welcoming entrance, if they start seeing us as being intrusive, we're building up behavioral problems right there. I mean, there's a way to build a behavioral problem is people literally get sick of you. And I say that not to be, haha. I mean, they really do get sick of you, which is one of the reasons that if students have the ability, I think they should be included in choosing who their paraprofessional is, especially for a one-on-one staff member. I don't. They should have some say in that if possible. And believe it or not, even with kids who are nonverbal and have maybe lower cognition, there are still ways to evaluate how they interact with people, who they choose to interact with, etc. So there are even ways for those students to be making some choices as well. So making certain that you have this rapport is to me a part of a broader picture of making sure that you have a classroom goal, and you have classroom themes, a context. You're building an environment. Maybe that's the better way to put it. You're building an environment that basically encompasses all of these different things. And I've talked about rapport, and I've talked about looking at behavioral management within that context of rapport. It's also important for me to say that I think you should look at supports versus services. And there are thoughts about that you've already been writing about and that you will read about, but that's to me another essential part of what we do. If part of our philosophy is, and part of that overall environment is that we are here to support students, not to provide services to students, it really sounds sometimes like a simple semantics kind of thing. But it really isn't, because if we're supporting students, then we're working for them. If we're providing services, we're acting on them. Okay? I don't mean quite, it's not quite that black and white, but it is really a big paradigm shift to go from services, I come in here, I do this thing, and then supports. Okay? So going back to what I said a bit earlier about a kid who's tantruming and somebody who's really upset about it, and after a minute they break bad or whatever. Okay, breaking bad, in my mind, that's a service model. Okay, so what I mean by that is, like, he did this, now I'm going to do this. In a supports model, it's like, he did this, and I know David, and David's a cool kid, and this is weird, he's doing this, and I wonder what's going on. That's a supports model. That's trying to figure out what's happening in concert with this student. So if we train early on the paraprofessionals that we work with to be looking at these important characteristics of being in the classroom with students, I think you're going to do quite a lot better. I really do. I really think so. One thing that I'll say that before I close, that I also have noticed in my work with paraprofessionals, and I don't know quite how to get around this, but I'm gonna make a suggestion. I'm just gonna make a suggestion that when you're talking to paraprofessionals, that you say to them, if ever I'm giving you something to do that you feel should be my work, or or if I'm not told you something, whatever, please let me know so I can correct that. Because in this population, this has been my experience, there is so much hands-on kind of work, right? Getting people ready. I was just thinking about, like, going to a school assembly, getting everybody ready, putting people in wheelchairs, right, whatever. It becomes very easy to start just depending on paraprofessionals to do things, and then suddenly we're treating them like they are our equals. And by equal, I don't mean who's better than that. I'm talking about licensed, unlicensed. That's all I mean, okay? So we're treating them like they're licensed. And then all of a sudden, something happens and we have to correct something or go back to something with them. And then people are pretty hacked off. It's like you basically leave me with this whole classroom and, or like I'm the one who, found Johnny down the hallway and you were doing whatever. And now, like, you're going to break bad, right? That whole division between certified and non certified is tough because really paraprofessionals are working really, really hard. I'm not saying they're working harder than teachers. I'm just saying they work really, really hard. They make far less money. Depending on where you are, they are treated not well a lot of times. That's just been my experience, like not well. And I think it's really difficult for me to hear those stories because they are so necessary to who we are. So making certain that you are open to dialogue around this seems like your job, or I wasn't sure this is what I was really contracted to do. Make that open that you can talk about that, so that when there is any kind of conflict in those areas, you've already had the conversation ahead of time, and then you can pick up on it. It really is hard because oftentimes they are working super, super, super hard, and they kind of go between being treated like you're in charge of everything and then shut up, you're a paraprofessional. You know what I mean? So I know, again, a lot of that stuff is not intended, but I know that it happens anyway, and it's just important that we make sure that that what we do, in the end, is not going to hamper a better relationship in the classroom and around. So, paraprofessionals to me really offer so much, and we couldn't run our classrooms without paraprofessionals. It seems to me that one of the ways that we can honor them is to make certain that what we do is bring forth the best in them. I don't understand why most school districts still don't work hard to be developing paraprofessional staff. I hope that if and when you're working with paraprofessional staff, that you do work to develop them, that you do work to teach them and educate them and give them the experiences that they can be very good at what they do, or they could move on possibly and go into teaching or do something else with the experience that they've had. But it's really an important thing that we honor them, I believe, by showing them that we believe in their skills, we believe in their abilities, and we want to support them just like we do our students and everybody else in becoming better people and better professionals. I was at a school not long ago, and I was observing a student teacher for NEIU, and I went in, and there's a paraprofessional there. She's really lovely, and then the teacher. And so when I was leaving, I walked up to the teacher and asked some questions or whatever, and gave her my card. And then I went up to her and I said, "Do you have any comments or anything, about?" And she kind of looked at me, and she said, "Well, no, I'm just the paraprofessional." And I said, "Oh, just the paraprofessional?" And I said, "It's okay, I said, "But if you have anything, I go, well, here's my card. Just take my card. If anything comes up and you want to let me know, I appreciate it." She goes, "You're going to give me a card?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, gosh, thank you." And she shook my hand. She goes, "I have never gotten a card as a paraprofessional before." I mean, she was being sort of like fun, but I think it really was touching. That there's this other adult standing in the room, and instead of just walking by her, like many people do, I made sure I paid attention to her as the paraprofessional, and I think it was meaningful to her to just be recognized in that setting, and I think that's what we can do well. And I know when you have those good relationships, because I've worked with some wonderful paraprofessionals, when those relationships are set, when we have our philosophy and our environment down, we have our behavior management let out in a way that is, or I'm sorry, written out in a way that is understood and by which they can lead from that, we've got a real formula for success. So I hope that if you try any of these things, it works well for you. Thanks.